Story time about how I was married to a serial killer. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I'm going to do this over several parts, but first let's just talk about how we met. Okay, so I was friends with this girl in the 6th grade, and we wound up living 3 doors down from each other. So we got to be really close, and I'd go over to her house after school a lot. And her brother was in the Navy, and so he wasn't around that much, and he was a lot older than I was, but he was in the Navy, and he would come home on leave. And that's how I got to know him, and I kind of had a crush on him. He was her older brother and everything. When I was about 16, he started flirting with me and decided to ask me out. And honestly, that probably sounds like a really red flag, but my family, their biggest red flag was just the fact that he was a lot older than me, but they felt kind of comfortable because they already knew the family and they could see how much we liked each other, so they supported it. Things moved really quickly, and before I knew it, he asked me to marry him. And honestly, that sounds crazy, except that my life was like really chaotic at the time. So when he asked me to marry him, I just jumped on it because it was like really the best thing I had going for me. So to answer a few of your guys' questions from my last video, yes, this is a true story about my life. And you guys definitely did your research. My ex-husband was Richard Ivanitz. I have written a book, and I'm looking for a publisher and agent. But in the meantime, I'm going to keep answering your questions, so stay tuned for part 2. Story time, how I was married to a serial killer, part 2. We got married in August of 1988, and we moved to Maine. And everything was fine at first. Honestly, I was happy to be married, and I had this, it was probably pretty immature fantasy about what married life meant, but I was happy to be up there and with him, and he very quickly took charge and let me know what my responsibilities were supposed to be to him as a wife, to clean the house and take care of all the cooking. And he was in the military, so there was like the lessons on how to properly launder his uniforms and do all of his creases just right. And I took all of this in and just worked really hard to please him. And I was happy to do that because, I loved him and I was wanting to make him happy. Probably within the first month, things began to shift. He started picking on me about my weight. I had gained about 10 pounds, and he started, telling me I was fat and that I needed to join Weight Watchers. If I cheated on my diet, he would tell me, you're gonna wind up being fat like your mother, and you can't do that. You need to get back on your program. I mean, up until this point, I felt pretty good about things overall, but as time was going on, I was regretting my choice of getting married, but I had made a commitment, and I believed in that commitment and in marriage, and that it's forever and that you have to work on it. And I also, had a lot of people tell me that I was too young to get married at the time. And so, I was pretty determined to prove everybody wrong that wasn't the case. Marriage was definitely not what I thought it would be. I'm going to go more into that in part 3. Story time about how I was married to a serial killer, Part 3. Things started off kind of rocky the first year, but by the summer of 1989, Mark was stationed in San Diego for shore duty, so we set out on a new adventure. At first, everything seemed really fun and romantic, getting settled in our new place, but pretty soon, things really shifted. He wanted me to get a job, but in order to get a job, I needed to be away from the house, and he needed me to be there when he got off of work. And he would get home from work at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And unfortunately, a lot of the jobs that I could get, having no education, meant, other than a high school diploma, it meant, evenings and weekends. And he didn't want me to do that. And he didn't support me in going to get a college education, which is something I thought I would be doing. Eventually, he did allow me to go to cosmetology school. Since it was only a year, he was willing to allow me to be away from home so that I could get situated with a job that would pay me more money than minimum wage, and I could work regular hours. Going to cosmetology school like really opened up my world and allowed me to get out of the house and make new friends. He didn't really like that very much, and he made it really clear from the very beginning that I wasn't to talk to anybody about our problems. You know, he would explain to me that like married people talk to each other about their problems. They don't talk to other people about their problems. Of course, at this point, I was 18, you know, and I'm out there and I don't have any friends. I don't have any family around, you know, and it was back before cell phones, back before the internet or email or anything. And it was a long distance phone call that, you know, kind of cost a lot of money back then. And he really limited the amount of money I was allowed to spend on phone calls to my family. Not having a lot of friends or anybody who I could talk to about my relationship, I really didn't know how different it was from the average marriage. And I really didn't have anybody to like bounce things off of and find out what was normal, which I think was probably exactly what he wanted. At this point, though, I was still committed to my marriage and I was still committed to making it work, you know, and most of the time things weren't really that bad. And, you know, I had a pretty good life out in San Diego. Then everything shifted again because he got out of the military. And I'll talk about that in part 4. Story time, being married to a serial killer, part 4. In November of 1992, Mark decided to get out of the military. The transition of him getting out of the military was a little rocky. He started having a lot of mood switches, and one day he came home. He was really frantic. He was just very anxious and beside himself, and he came in the door and he asked me, he said, if I asked you to fly out of the country with me, would you do it? And I was like, what do you mean? What the hell? Why would you ask me that? He's like, just answer the question. Would you go with me if I needed to get out of the country, if I wanted to leave the country? And I said, well, I don't know. Why do you need to go? I don't know if I want to live out. And he shut me down and he said, no, if I needed to leave the country, would you go with me? And I says, well, I guess so. I mean, we're married. Like, why am I going to stay here? Of course I'm going to go with you. And as soon as I said that, he just like, he breathed a big sigh of relief and he's just like, oh, okay. He just kind of like went on about his day and he was just like, well, I just had a real, I don't know, I was just really stressed out. I just had a really rough day and I just needed to know that, you know, like no matter what, you'd be with me. So there were things like that eventually played into future things. Like looking back at that seems kind of crazy. But at the time, I thought he was just really stressed out about work because it was a huge transition for him to get out of the military and, you know, move to Virginia and start a new life and try to get a job. We decided on Virginia because he had family in Virginia. We decided that instead of going to South Carolina where he was from and where his mom and sisters lived. With my cosmetology license, I couldn't do hair in South Carolina without doing more testing. Virginia had reciprocity with California, so it seemed like the perfect spot. And he really played it up and sold it to me that it was just going to be this really amazing place to be. I went along with it even though my family had moved out to San Diego since we were there, and I didn't know anybody in Virginia, and I would have rather gone back to South Carolina or even just stayed in San Diego because, you know, my family had moved out there while we lived there. So, like I said, November 1992, we headed off for our next stop in Virginia. More on that in part 5.
This lady is basically telling the story about how she fell in love and married a serial taking outer, And I'm not sure, is it just me that find her to be extremely calm telling this story? I mean, from part one up until the very last part, she's just so calm about it, where to me, let's not judge. Just listen to the story and tell me your comment. Tell me what you think in the comment section below. This is interesting.
Story time, How I Was Married to a Serial Killer, Part 5. In November 1992, he got out of the Navy and we moved to Virginia to start a new life. Once we got there, that's when things really started to change. To start with, he was out of work for about 6 months and he was able to collect unemployment, and I was able to get a job as a hairstylist. But in the beginning, you don't really make any money as a hairstylist until you have a clientele. And so I was working, but I wasn't really making any money. So between the two of us, after rent and car payment and everything, we had about $25 a week left over for groceries. And so that meant, we spent several days a week, spending the evenings having dinner with his family, which honestly saved our lives. The other way things started changing was he fell into a bit of a depression, and his personality was different. He was always very upbeat and fun and happy and telling jokes, but instead he was just he's more moody, and he started talking about how he wanted to smoke pot. It was definitely not something I had ever had as a part of my life, and it wasn't something that I was interested in at all. But I guess it was something that he had done before the military, and now that he was out of the military and not being tested anymore, he just felt like, you know what, I'm going to do it and you just have to deal with it. So up until that point, when he started talking about, when he got out of the military and he started talking about wanting to smoke weed again, his entire personality around drugs and alcohol was this clean, sober life. And it was something that was compatible with me. When he starts talking about wanting to smoke pot again, it was really just so beyond anything that I wanted around me. But I couldn't talk to anybody about it because we weren't supposed to share any of our problems with anybody. That was something that he continuously reinforced in me, that that I wasn't supposed to talk to anybody about what was going on in our relationship. And of course, looking back, I definitely feel like had I been able to reach out and talk to people, it would have probably have allowed me to move on a little bit faster than what I did, because that was definitely a red flag that he had no consideration for me and how I felt about having that in my house. He only smoked it around me this one time where he drove me around in our car. He wanted to go for a drive on these country roads and show me places he had been, and he pulled out a joint that he had rolled up and lit it up, and I'm just sitting there completely horrified, and he kept wanting me to try it. He's like, oh, come on, just try it. He really wanted me to do that with him. I didn't want to, but eventually I kind of gave in. I tried to smoke it, but I couldn't quite figure it out, because that's just, I don't know, that's just me. I don't know what to tell you about that. Again, these are the kind of things that happened. Looking back, it's definitely puts things under a different frame, but certainly doesn't lead me to think that he's out killing anybody. We weren't really doing very well financially, and so I decided that I was just gonna do something else. So I found a job waiting tables and was making pretty good money, and that really did help a lot financially because he still wasn't working. Then one day I was waiting tables on this really beautiful lady. She had really beautiful hair color, and I commented on her hair color, and she said, oh, well, thank you, I'm a hairdresser. And I'm like, wow, so am I. She's like, what the hell are you doing here? Why aren't you doing hair? You shouldn't be waiting tables. She handed me a card and told me to go talk to her mom, and I was able to go find a job finally as a hairdresser in Virginia, and that changed things a lot. And he finally found a job, and things really started to stabilize, and we were going to be able to buy a house, which was just really just everything we were wanting. And I was hoping to be able to start a family and everything else. But as we were in the house buying process, things began to change. And I will get into that in part 6. How I was married to a serial killer, part 6. Okay, I want to back up here for just a minute. A lot of you guys have been asking whether or not I knew about his conviction in 1987 prior to us getting together. So what he had told me about it was that he had been blacked out drunk. I guess he had a really severe drinking problem, and he was driving around Jacksonville, Florida, blacked out drunk, and apparently driving around naked. And some girls had seen him. This landed him arrested and in a rehabilitation center for his drug and alcohol addiction. By the next year, when we were starting to see one another, he had embraced his sobriety and his alcohol and drug-free lifestyle. Honestly, at the time, I was impressed. I thought that it took a lot of courage to face his inner demons and deal with the things that were causing him to drink. Of course, at the time, I was only 17. Actually, I was 16 at the time. So I really didn't know the greater implications of addiction, or even what it meant to have an addiction, or why people are addicted, or I didn't know any of that. At the time, I just thought he was doing really well, and I was impressed, like I said. And I was not somebody who drank at the time. I was a teenager, and we also have to back up that this was the 80s, and the big campaign on just say no, and this is your brain on drugs, and all that kind of stuff. I was 100% on board with that. And this had been drilled into my head since, I was 13 years old. So to be with somebody who was choosing a sober life really appealed to me. By the time we moved to Virginia, we had already been married for 4 years, and alcohol and drugs had never been a part of our relationship. So when he decided that he was going to start smoking pot and wanting me to do it, it was pretty alarming, because that was not something that I had planned on having in my life. And we have to remember, it was illegal then, and people were going to jail. And I didn't want to get in trouble for something that wasn't even part of my life. Having something in my house and not even having a choice about it put me at risk at also getting in trouble. I didn't find out the truth about his conviction until after I found out that he was a serial killer, back in 2002. That's when I found out that he had actually masturbated in front of a 3-year-old girl, I believe. Of course, that's a huge difference. And had I heard that, I definitely would have made a different decision about whether I wanted to be with this person. But at the time, all I knew was that alcohol had caused him to make a bad decision, that he had been drinking and he was blacked out and somehow took his clothes off and was driving around, and somebody just happened to see him. That's all I knew. And in my 16-year-old brain, that made sense to me. More in part 7. How I was married to a serial killer, part 7. Okay, so I left off at the end of part 5 where we were getting ready to buy a house in Virginia. And it was around that time when everything shifted. Somewhere around that time, he began having what I tend to refer to as rages, where, you know, one minute we would just be sitting there having a normal conversation, and the next minute he's up shouting at me and cursing, and one time he punched a hole in the wall. He would always wind up being emotional afterwards and crying and apologetic, talking about his childhood and all the terrible things his dad had done to him. And he'd swear that he was going to get help and that he would call somebody in the morning, and the morning would come and it would be as if nothing had happened, and he would just be carrying on with his day, and we never heard anything else about it. I kind of chalked up a lot of it to stress. You know, we were getting ready we were building a house. He had changed jobs, and there were a lot of things that were up in the air at the time. And in my mind, I thought, well, once we get into our house and begin getting settled in our life, that he'll settle down and he'll be happy, and that this would all just kind of wash over. So when we were in our house about 6 months and he flew into one of these rages, this was the third time it had happened. And the first time being maybe, 6 months to a year before. It was like happening this was like the third time in 6 months. And it really shattered my bubble. It shattered this whole fantasy that I had. I was moving into my new house, and we were going to start a family, and I was meeting my neighbors, and we lived on a little cul-de-sac. It was like everything that anybody would ever want. But when this happened, it just shattered that bubble for me. And that's what made me start to question whether or not it was a good idea to try to bring a baby into this situation. Things felt really unstable to me, which made me feel kind of pretty unhappy. And he started to realize that I was unhappy and started to make demands of me to figure out what it was that I was going to do, if I was going to stay or if I was going to leave. I really didn't want to end my marriage. I just wanted to be happy, and I wanted stability, and everything that was happening made me feel really uneasy. So he agreed at first to go see a counselor, and we went to a couple of counseling appointments. I can't remember. I feel like I went on my own once. Maybe he went on his own once, and we went together. And when we went together afterwards, he basically told me that he felt like the counselor was on my side and that she was biased, and that he wanted to find a different counselor, or he just wasn't even willing to go because he felt like, it was just really unfair and that she was against him. I didn't really know what to do at the time, but eventually I decided to leave. Everything came to a head this one night when I had come home from a ballet class that I was taking, and the class ended at 9 o'clock, so I got home around 9:15, and I walked in the door. And when you walked into our house, there was like the entryway, and off the entryway was an office. He was sitting at the desk in the office, and he saw me walk by and immediately started berating me about, where have you been? What are you really doing? I know you're not taking a dance class. I know you're seeing somebody behind my back. Why don't you just tell me? You just want to leave. By this point, he had gotten up from behind the desk and was coming around and getting up in my face, continuing to yell at me about how I was lying to him and how he didn't believe me. When the phone rang, he decided to answer it while he was like in the middle of this fit he was beginning to have. As soon as he answered the phone, he flipped a switch and he was like, "Hi, how are you? Gosh, it's so great to hear from you." And he walked right past me and went into the hallway and down into the basement to take the call. And it was at that time that I thought, I really need to get out of here right now, because that really freaked me out, that he shifted from really pissed off to super happy in just a snap. So I immediately grabbed my things. I already had my purse in my hand and my stuff, but I grabbed a couple more things and just slid right out the front door, got in my car, and I drove away. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I wound up calling a friend who let me stay at her house. And I actually stayed there, was able to talk to my family who were out in California at the time. And they encouraged me to come out there and stay with them for a little bit and try to figure things out. During that night, he was leaving messages on my cell phone, which sounded, he was really upset, saying things like, "Don't come home. You don't have a home. You've just ruined our entire marriage. We don't have a marriage anymore." Just kind of crazy things like that. And it was upsetting to me, but at the same time, certainly looking back, I think, shoot, I wonder, if I hadn't left, what would have happened that night. At the time, I just felt really uncomfortable and thought I needed to not be home. It was after that I decided that I was going to go to San Diego, where my brother lived, and stay with him for a little while and start, moving on to a different part of my life. A couple of days later, we wound up talking on the phone, and he agreed that he would be out of the house on the weekend, and I could come pack up my stuff so that I could leave. And that's what I did. I spent the weekend in my home for the last time, and I packed up my car with as many things as I could, and I hit the road for California. More in part 8. How I Was Married to a Serial Killer, Part 8. So I left Virginia and I headed across the country to San Diego, where I stayed with my brother, who had moved there at the same time when Mark and I were living there before. While I was there, I met Scott, who's now my late husband, and there's more to that later. He lived in Northern California, so I came up here and I met him, and we fell in love, we got married, and I had a couple of babies. And when my second kid was 3 months old, the FBI showed up at my door. I had been warned the day before from his cousin, who had called me to tell me that the FBI was at her parents' place and asking questions. And she had basically just told me that they had given the FBI my information, knowing that I'd be happy to talk to them. And all she knew was something about a girl in a box, and that he was on drugs and kind of deranged, and they were worried that maybe he was heading my way to California. The next morning, I'm in my living room with my kids, who are 3 months and 2 years old at the time, just going about our normal day, and the FBI showed up at the door, and the first thing they said was Richard was dead. And it kind of threw me back, because Richard is his first name, but he went by Mark. So it took me a minute to realize who they were talking about, and then, let it sink in, the fact that he was dead. They came in and sat down, and they told me that Mark had kidnapped a 15-year-old girl in South Carolina. He had stolen his mom's car while she was on vacation with his wife in Disneyland, and he kidnapped her in broad daylight in her front yard, put a gun to her head, and made her get into the back seat of his car where he had a plastic container, and he made her get into this plastic container. You can hear all about her story because she is probably the absolute most badass person I've ever heard of. She's amazing. She's a survivor. I just got a divorce. She has a movie and a podcast, and she got into law enforcement. And let me tell you, this girl is one badass because she escaped. She got out while he was sleeping, and she was able to direct the authorities back to his apartment where they found newspaper clippings about unsolved murders in Virginia. When they got back to his apartment, he had fled, and they caught up with him in Florida. There was a high-speed chase. They flattened out his tires, and he got out of the car, and he put a gun to his head, and he killed himself. They went on to tell me that before he had died, he had conversations with his sister in the car on the cell phone, and he had told her at that time that he had committed more crimes than he could remember. But since he killed himself before anybody could figure all that out, there's still to this day ongoing investigations into cold cases that they're trying to solve. The FBI was just so happy to find me alive and normal and having a normal life with my kids and my husband and my house. And they were just beyond thrilled to see that I had survived that situation. Of course, I had no idea I survived anything. All I did was leave kind of a messed up marriage, and this was all just beyond shocking news. They asked me if it would be okay to ask me a bunch of questions, really personal questions about my life with him. They viewed me as a way of profiling him and also a way of providing a timeline because I was married to him for 8.5 years. They explained to me that they found newspaper clippings about some unsolved murders in Virginia, one of which happened before I left the marriage. It was in September, the year before I left, and at that time, I had gone to San Diego to visit my brother. They told me that that seemed to be the way that he operated, was that he was committing crimes when his wife was away. So the fact that I was able to show them that I was out of town showed that he had the opportunity to have committed that particular crime. The other two murders that were confirmed were after I had left the marriage. They were in May the following year. My conversations with the detectives and the FBI helped to confirm some facts that helped to prove that he had indeed been the one to murder all three of those girls. So like I said in my previous video, I just had, at the time that this all dropped at my door, I had 2 babies at home. I mean, I'm sitting there through these interviews with my baby on my lap and my toddler on the floor playing blocks, and worried that, like, what are they listening to? How is this going to affect them? My baby wanted to nurse, and I'm just trying to get through this interview. It was extremely stressful. It was very surreal. This seems like something that would happen, in the movies. It doesn't seem like real life. Like, this can't be happening to me. How could that be? I had a marriage, and it was fucked up, and I left it and moved forward, found something new, healed that part of my life, and then I just find out that this wasn't anything I had even it was nothing that I thought it was. Entire marriage was a lie. So that made me really look back at everything with an entirely different lens than what I had previously. And I'll go into more in part 9. Hey guys, I just wanted to stop on here for a second and take a break with my stories about being married to a serial killer. And I wanted to just take a minute and thank you guys for, like, wow, thank you so much for following me, and like so much love and support, encouragement to write my book and to keep on going. I do have a book that I have written, and I'm working on getting a publisher or an agent who's willing to take it on. It's a lot to unpack. It's an unusual story, and so I've had trouble getting anybody really willing to take it on. Also, I'm completely new, obviously, to TikTok. I've never done a video in my life, and it's a lot to talk about, and to talk about it in a way that'll come across in a smooth story form. And like, I did not expect this to blow up, I'll be honest. I was just thinking, hey, maybe I should start getting a social media presence and, try to get the word out there. And wow, I'm like beyond blown away at so much interest and support. So I don't have a bunch of stuff sitting there waiting to post. I'm not trying to torture you. I am literally working on it every day, and I still have a regular job. So I do think there's going to be another post up pretty soon today, and I have another one hopefully that'll get lined up for tomorrow. So hang in there. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. How finding out my ex-husband was a serial killer gave me PTSD. I just wanted to hop on here real quick and answer a couple of questions. Everybody's been super kind and wondering how I'm doing and how I'm feeling, and how I handled getting the news that my ex-husband, Richard Ivanitz, was a serial killer. So when I first found out about it, back in 2002, when the FBI showed up at my door, I really didn't have any time to deal with it. I had 2 babies, and one of them was 3 months old, one of them was 2 years old, and to be honest, I was in shock about finding it out, and but I really couldn't deal with it right then. I just kind of pushed it aside and went about raising my kids. I didn't really have a chance to break down and deal with it at the time. And about 2 years later, I started having panic attacks, which, kind of landed me in the doctor's office, and into the therapist chair. And I had to take some medication for a while and go through a lot of therapy. And in therapy, I found out that I had PTSD from finding out such, traumatizing news and, not processing it. It's taken a lot of time. It's been 22 years. And, I have to say that at this point, I'm doing pretty well with it. It definitely has its moments where it comes out, and my current relationship and, or in my relationships over the last, several years. And obviously, talk about trust issues, it's definitely a whole different level of things when, you thought your life was one thing, you get married and you have a divorce, and, you process your divorce, and you mourn that relationship, and you move forward, and you find a new relationship, and then you find out that none of that was even what you thought it was. And, it definitely brings up a lot of questions and makes you question everything, pretty much every person in your life, comes under scrutiny. But to answer your question, I'm at this point in my life, I'm doing pretty well. And, I think honestly, for the most part, most people are good people. and you can't live your life in fear, because I honestly, I just don't think you're ever really going to know who somebody is. And I can't live my life wondering and being in fear about that. That's pretty much to answer your guys' question, and I appreciate so much all the love and support, and the people who have taken the time to stop and be concerned about my well-being. I really appreciate that, and I'm working on the next part of the series, so stay tuned. Answering your most asked question about being married to a serial killer. Were there any indications along the way that I remember about him that would make me think that he was a serial killer? Honestly, no. There was nothing that indicated this to me. The first question I asked the FBI when they told me was, how did I not know that this was going on when I was married to him for 8.5 years? Their answer to me was that serial killers are usually sociopaths, and sociopaths are really good at compartmentalizing. So when they're over here doing one thing, and then they're over here doing something else, the two things do not bleed over. And so it's really easy for them to hide things. That in fact, if I had seen signs, then he wouldn't have been a sociopath, and he probably wouldn't have gotten away with the crimes the way that he did. And I know this isn't anything that anybody wants to hear, but that was what the FBI had told me. And looking back at my life through this new lens, certainly things stand out in a different light than they did when I was married to him. But still, nothing really that would make me think that he had committed these crimes. How I was married to a serial killer, part 9. I left off last time when the FBI had dropped the news about Mark being a serial killer, and how that changed my lens that I now looked back at my marriage. Suddenly I had all these memories and all these things that never really stood out to me before, but in this new light, I started looking at things quite differently. One of the things was when we lived in San Diego, he always had me going to self-defense classes and was concerned that I know how to defend myself, and was always looking over my shoulder and paying attention to my surroundings, and getting quickly into my car, and if there was ever somebody who would approach me, or if I was ever in a situation, that I would know how to defend myself. That certainly looked a lot different looking back than it did at the time. I mean, of course, a lot of people did that. It is definitely interesting that he was basically teaching me how to protect myself against somebody like him. So the other thing that really stood out in my mind when I heard the news was when we were living in Virginia the last year. They thought at the time that there were 2 serial killers living among us. There was a lot of things that were happening. It was a pretty stressful time. It had a lot of us speculating about who this person was, and everybody was glued to the news, and it was just a really scary time, especially for women. I remember one evening in particular, after watching the news, being concerned and expressing my concern to him about that I was afraid, and I came home late at night. I would work until 9 o'clock at night at this point at the salon. I was worried about being out late by myself, and he assured me that he didn't really think I had anything to worry about, because I didn't fit the profile of the women that were being killed. At the time, there was this guy who was pulling over women, flagging them down like they were having car trouble. Most of the people, I think, got away, but there was one girl who was murdered, and that's still, I believe, it's still an unsolved case at this time. That was the person I was worried about. We were all really stressed out about this thing. So he was telling me how I didn't fit the profile, and I didn't really understand what he was talking about, because like I don't, I was never, I'm still not somebody who follows true crime. I was like, what do you mean profile? And he said, well, he says serial killers usually have a particular type of person that they're looking for. So maybe they don't like their mother, or they're angry with their mother. So they try to find somebody who looks like their mother, and they can kill their mother without actually killing their mother. I kind of understood what he was saying, but it didn't really make me feel any better, because I kind of felt like there were too many things going on in the area at the time to make me just kind of feel at ease. And I wasn't following it closely enough to really be sure that I didn't fit some type of profile that he was talking about. But he was always reading everything and watching the news, and he was really up on everything. So, and he was kind of a know-it-all, and he liked to, act like he knew everything. So I just kind of, I sort of took his word for it and went from there. Looking back though, it certainly does seem like he's letting me know, hey, you're safe. It's not going to happen to you. The other thing is he always had kind of a dark sense of humor. And I mean, in just a sense of humor in general. He was always joking about everything. And then he often had a dark sense of humor. And a lot of people have a dark sense of humor. So again, not something that you would typically need to be concerned about. But looking back with this new lens, I distinctly remember a day when, again, it was during this time when there was a serial killer, and they were just starting to identify the fact that they felt like they had a serial killer on their hands. And we were getting ready for work, listening to the news, and Mark walks from the kitchen into the living room holding his bowl of cornflakes. And he's walking into the living room holding his bowl of cornflakes and the spoon, and he's stabbing the cereal with his spoon, saying, "Look, I'm a serial killer," as a play on words. At the time, I was just like, you're an idiot. That's not funny. But it's just kind of the way he was. He was always making light of things, or just doing plays on words, joking around. I kind of rolled my eyes. I'm just like, oh my God, that's a bad one. And I went ahead and got ready for work and kind of went on about my day. And of course, looking back at that, that's fucking terrifying, because he's basically telling me, hey, look at me, I'm a serial killer. He told me. I don't really know don't know what to tell you guys. It's a whole nother thing, like looking back is always different than when you're going through things. But those were two definite situations where, looking back, it's pretty disturbing. More in part 10. Hey guys, just wanted to pop on here real quick and say thank you for all your support in waiting for me to come out with the next part of my video. It's taken a bit of an emotional toll going through this process to post these videos. So the past few days, I just sort of took a break and worked on some self-care and just getting grounded, spending time with my boyfriend and my dog and my kitties. and worked in the garden, and today I got a massage, which is why my eyelashes look kind of scrunchy. And I guess my face was in a face cradle this afternoon, which was much needed. And like I said in previous videos, I wasn't really expecting all of this. I didn't have a particular plan in mind, but I will spend some more time answering your questions. My next video, I'm going to talk about trust issues, as a lot of you guys have questioned how it's possible for me to trust ever again. But again, I just wanted to say thank you. I really appreciate those of you who have been patient with me and have supported me with your comments, and recognize that this is not easy for me to do. So talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye. How I was married to a serial killer, part 10. Okay guys, sorry for the delay in posting. I'm not going to get into my reasons. I'm just going to get right to it. I left off last time with talking about when the FBI had showed up at my door and delivered the news that my ex-husband was a serial killer. And in looking back over my life, things looked way different through this new lens of knowledge. And one of the things that you guys have been asking me is, how do you trust, or how do you love after finding something like this out? So at the time when I found out that he was a serial killer, I was married and I had 2 babies. One was 3 months old and one was 2 years old. So I really didn't have a whole lot of time to think about that. But over time, it definitely created some issues in my marriage, because it made me begin to question my husband. You know, the fact that I had trusted him as well, and the fact that I had absolutely no clue that my ex-husband had been doing these things. And even though we had trouble in our marriage, it certainly didn't point to anything out of the ordinary at this level. So I began overly analyzing what was happening in my marriage, or whether or not he was telling me the truth about his life, and what he was doing, and all of those types of things. But over time, as I looked back, one of the things that I noticed was that I did have bad feelings that something was going on. I really thought that, maybe he was having an affair or something like that. That's really what I thought. And I would go through his things occasionally, trying to find clues. I never found anything. And, the truth is that he was always exactly where he was supposed to be. Now, of course, this was way back before cell phones and everything. I think probably, a few months before I left Virginia, I had gotten my first cell phone, and that was I left in January of 1997. So this was not, it wasn't a regular thing to call home and, check in on each other. We would go through the entire day without any type of contact. And we both got up in the morning and went on about our business. He was always home when he was supposed to be. We had dinner together. We went over our day. There was nothing at all out of the ordinary. I did have an instinct that something wasn't right. But when I would question him about this, he would always say things to make me doubt my intuition. He definitely defended himself and assured me that there was nothing going on, that I was jealous and insecure and I had issues. And, you know, at this point in our marriage, I didn't trust my intuition because of so many years of being taught to doubt my intuition. So if there's anything I would suggest to people who are in relationships where they feel like something's off, I would say to trust that. And I am in no position to give advice on what to do if you're in an abusive relationship and you're unsafe and you need to get out. I definitely recommend finding somebody to talk to, and you know, if it's a hotline, if it's a close friend, if it's anybody, I would definitely recommend finding a way to get help and break the silence. I did not have the feeling that I was in an unsafe relationship and that I was actually escaping. I did have, at the time when I started having problems and telling him that I wanted to, I didn't tell him that I wanted a divorce. I told him I was unhappy, and he told me that I wanted a divorce. And so in making that decision, things did get very sketchy. I go into more of this type of stuff in my book. I'm not going to go through all of the scenes that happened. But I will say that in looking back and seeing that there weren't any specific signs that made me think that this could be going on, it definitely created issues in my marriage, and I began not trusting him. Up until the time that I had found out this news, I was a pretty trustful person. I never had I take, and I still do tend to take things at face value. I am a trustworthy person. I don't lie. I don't create, I'm not ever trying to be something other than who I am. And therefore, I don't think that other people are behaving that way towards me. The way that I dealt with back when I first learned about Mark and the crimes that he committed, the way that I dealt with it then was just realizing that had I found anything that suggested that this was going on when I was searching through his things, looking for evidence of an affair, if I had figured it out, I might not be alive today. So the fact that I didn't know saved me. And I still do believe that. I don't know what would have happened if I would have found something and confronted it. I don't know what he would have done. So I kind of found peace in the fact of, I'm going to know what I'm going to know. I'm going to find out what I need to find out. And the things that I'm not meant to know, then that's just the way it goes. And I can't go through life wondering all the what ifs and of things that there's no way I could possibly know. You can't know everything about every person. Everybody has private parts that they don't share. Normally, they're not private parts as crazy as these types of private parts, but you definitely, everybody has private aspects of themselves, and you're never going to know anything other than what people want you to know and your gut feeling on whether that lines up or feels right. So the big takeaway that I had was that I needed to trust my intuition. And I've grown much better at realizing what my intuition is telling me. And even if I don't quite understand it, I listen to it and I question things and look for answers. And ultimately, if it doesn't feel right, then I get out of the situation. At the time when I found out about Mark and his murders and being a serial killer, I was under the impression that he had murdered only one person during our marriage. But in recent years, that information has changed as they're investigating more and more crimes, which makes it look like he could have been doing it during our marriage, before our marriage. And that changes everything. More in part 11.
Imagine marrying the love of your life and having children with that person, and every single night you sit at the dinner table and have dinner with that person, and then he read his children a bedtime story and then change into his uniform to go out into the world and do the unthinkable to other people, and then come back, take a shower, lay next to you, go to sleep, give you a good night kiss, and then go to sleep right next to you and do the same thing over and over and over again. And you possibly have no idea. Well, maybe you do, because